And welcome to Doubts Welcome, a ministry dedicated to answering your doubts, questions, and concerns about the Bible, God, and Christianity. Today we're continuing our Bible study series on the Gospel according to John, and as you can see, we are looking at John chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. The Word became flesh and was greater than John the Baptist. In our last video, we talked about those who receive the Word and what it means to be children of God. If you haven't watched that video yet, that's fine, but I would suggest going back and doing so as well as the other videos for John, because as I've said before, context is king when it comes to biblical interpretation. Our video here is the crux of the passage. It is very important for us to understand what is going on with the Word and with Jesus Christ, and why all of this matters. So with that, let's go ahead and get into our text so we can start unpacking the theology. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed His glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning Him and exclaimed, "This was the one of whom I said, the one coming after me has surpassed me because he existed before me." So let's take a look at verse 14 and see what's going on here. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. This is the point at which John makes it crystal clear that the Word and Jesus are one and the same. Flesh here means everything that makes a human human. The only exception being sin, which, whether or not sin is actually necessary to consider a human, is a whole nother discussion for another video, and I'm honestly not sure that we could even come up with a 100% sure answer on that. But other passages in the New Testament make it clear that Jesus did not sin, however God made him sin for us, and that might be something to discuss in that video. In Greek thought, the gods were pretty well completely separate from human beings and all of the worries and the pains. Now obviously they did have gods that came down and copulated with women, so they can't be that far separated, but they wouldn't have understood what humans were really going through, which will be important here in a minute. Docetism and Gnosticism, which we've talked a little bit about before in other videos, kind of had this idea and tried to bring it into Christianity, where anything that was matter was evil, and therefore God couldn't touch matter because God couldn't be near evil, and he definitely could not have a body of his own. But here John is saying, no, the Word became flesh. This Word that was God, is God, became flesh. Now, the word translated took up residence is a word for a temporary dwelling. Obviously, Jesus was only here for a little bit. He's not here now. We do believe that he still has his exalted body, that is the body that he got after he rose from the grave, that the scars are still there, or the wounds. Not that they're still bleeding necessarily. That may be another discussion for another video as well. But the more important idea here that John's trying to portray, especially to any of his audience that would have had knowledge of the Old Testament, is hearkening back to the tabernacle that God had Moses and the Israelites build as a place of worship and a place for God to dwell among them in the wilderness, which also got used for quite a while after they conquered the land of Canaan as well. Just as the glory of God dwelt in that tabernacle, it is now dwelling in a human body. This also serves to show us again that Jesus is fully human. We observed his glory. John's use of glory here also serves to compare Jesus to the Jewish concept of the Shekinah glory, which is the presence of God. John, as well as Peter and James, got a special view of that glory on the Mount of Transfiguration, which would have been quite the sight to see. It should also be mentioned here that the Word didn't cease to exist when it became flesh. It was still there, and this shows that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, which is something that we definitely need to talk about in another video. If you want a big theological word for free today, hypostatic union is what that is called, where Jesus has a godly nature and a human nature. Now, to those who witnessed the life of Jesus, they would have seen this glory in the things that he did, and John here wants to make sure that his audience knows he really saw this. It wasn't just a vision or a dream. As we will see a little bit later in John 3, there were also religious leaders that knew that Jesus was from God because of the kind and sheer volume of miracles he was performing. The glory as the one and only Son from the Father. Now, some of your translations here might say only begotten. I would say that one and only Son is a better translation, but I want to talk about that in another video. I don't want to fill this video with the Greek and all of that. The point, though, of both of those really is to show that he is one of a kind, completely unique. He's the only one that has come from the Father like this. Going on, we have full of grace and truth. Grace and truth are concepts that show the love of God for all humanity. Grace is unmerited favor, and truth harkening back to what we talked about in our video covering verse 9 concerning the true light. Jesus taught us truth, and he even claimed to be truth, and both of those, grace and truth, are also attributes that are applied to Yahweh in the Old Testament. Now, the question that we want to ask here is why it is important that the Word became flesh. Well, the first thing is that our sins require death, specifically our death. If you look back at the Old Testament in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve have been talking to God and they say, yeah, we ate of the fruit, and of course they pass on the blame to each other and then to the serpent. But God says at the end of when he's cursing Adam, from the dust you came, to the dust you shall return, which to me indicates that back in chapter 2, when he talked about you can eat from any tree of the garden, just not that one over there, in the day you eat of it you will die, indicating that that is a physical death. Now, it took a while to take place, but it still happened, and that's something we can discuss in a video when we get to that particular passage. There are other passages in the Old Testament that talk about human sin requiring death, specifically their own, but then also in the law of Moses, God said instead of your own, you can provide a perfect sacrifice in your place. Perfect there being no blemishes, no broken bones, etc. Those sacrifices, though, weren't enough to actually pay for and cover the sins entirely, as we can see in Hebrews when we get to that. And so in my mind, the idea here is they're relying on God accepting those sacrifices in place of their own life for their sins. So that would be pointing towards what God would do here with Jesus. The second reason why it's important is so that he could relate to our struggles, and this is something again we see in Hebrews, that we don't have a high priest that doesn't understand us. He does understand us fully, completely. He's gone through life as we have, being tempted in the same ways we've been tempted, but without sin. And that's something that we'll talk more about when we get to Hebrews 4:15, but if you want to go ahead and take a look at that, please feel free to. Now, moving on from there, we get another testimony from John the Baptist. John testified concerning him and exclaimed, "This was the one of whom I said, the one coming after me has surpassed me, because he existed before me." Now, I believe the reason why we get another testimony here from John is to strengthen the connection between the Word and Jesus. John the Baptist had given a testimony about the Word earlier in our passage, and now he's giving a testimony about the Word having become flesh. So again, saying that this is the same person. And so here we have John the Baptist saying that Jesus is greater than him. Now, the phrase, because he existed before me, is a little odd. Firstly, if you assume that Jesus was born before John the Baptist, that still wouldn't make him greater just because he was born first. Now, in that culture, of course, the firstborn son was supposed to be the one who got everything. At the same time, we know that the firstborn didn't always get everything. King David, for example, he was the 7th son of Jesse, not the first, and yet he became king of Israel because God appointed him to that. Solomon was also not David's first son, but Solomon became king after David did. But this phrase, because he existed before me, takes on whole new meaning when, if you look at Luke 1:36, you realize that John the Baptist is actually 6 months older than Jesus. So therefore, at least from a human perspective, Jesus didn't exist before John. However, since Jesus is the Word, and the Word was clear back at the beginning, as far back as you want to push time, he did indeed exist before John. Not only that, he created John, but that's kind of reading in previous verses into this one a little bit, which is okay because that's part of the context, right? Now, unfortunately, John the Baptist did have his own doubts about Jesus. We can see this when he's thrown into prison by Herod just before he gets beheaded, but we'll talk more about those doubts when we get to them. Now, some also believe that John the Baptist here was referring to Jesus as a more important figure, a preeminent figure, because the Greek before could also be translated not in a chronological sense, but in a chief sense, a more important sense. In either case, he's testifying that Jesus is greater than he is. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought, what I could do better. If you think this would be useful for your family, friends, or church group, please share it with them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, hit that bell notification icon so you know when I post a new video. And don't forget to send me in your questions about this or any other thing that is biblical or Christian related, or comparing Christianity or the Bible to some other religion or holy text. And I'll get to working on those as soon as I can. In our next video, we'll be discussing John 1 verses 15 through 16, which talk about the grace we receive from Christ and compare that to what Moses has given us. And remember, bring on the doubts because you are always welcomed.